Disculpe, ¿puede enseñarme la filosofía de Ayn Rand?
No, esto violaría mi propio interés. Hello, and welcome. I'm Dr. Zachariah Renfro, and I hope that you will enjoy this lecture today on egoism. We're going to cover psychological egoism, ethical egoism, and we will also cover social contract theory at the end. The common theme of these different philosophies is the theme of self-interest. So let's get started with psychological egoism. First developed by Max Stirner in the 1800s, it's this idea that our ultimate goal is self-governance. Now, to us today, that might sound kind of weird, but we have to remember that Stirner is one of the original founders of the idea of anarchism as a political philosophy, meaning that he thought that all institutions such as the state or government or bureaucracy or religions were just spooks that haunted us, that there were false entities, and that we ourselves should be the only judge of our morality and of our lives. So he says that it's impossible for us to be altruistic. It's impossible because we cannot understand other people and we cannot understand ourselves, right? Our subconscious goes so deep that we have no idea where we are in relation to ourselves. His philosophy is to some extent a response to Hegel and Hegel's more monarchist republican type of theory, this idea that history was moving towards a constitutional monarchy. Stirner thought that that was all a bunch of hoopla, and that instead society needed for us to go more free, because the only way for us to transfer property or for us to gain control is through force, through exercises of power, right? So according to Stirner, we can't act for another person's interest because all of our actions are inward facing, right? We don't understand other people in the same way that we don't understand ourselves. So we can't act for another person because we cannot understand them. But it's important to note that this theory, it's non-falsifiable, meaning that no matter what you do, Stirner's going to say that you're doing it out of selfishness. So for example, suppose that you jumped in front of a bullet to save someone's life. Stirner would say, well, you didn't do that because you cared about saving that other person. Stirner's going to say that you did it just because you wanted to get the recognition that comes with being a hero and saving someone's life. So moving on to ethical egoism. Now this actually takes us a little bit back in time, but then we'll go a little bit forward in time. In the 1700s, Adam Smith argued in the commercial sector for a type of ethical egoism. So this is that businesses do best not by cooperating, but by acting in their own self-interest. He uses the example of a baker in The Wealth of Nations, right? The baker, when he's baking bread, he's not doing it because he wants to make sure everyone has bread. He's doing it because he wants to earn some money from the sale of that bread, right? He argued that all of our selfish actions, all of our self-seeking will have a larger combining effect, which is that the kind of spontaneous order, this larger combining effect. So, all these bakers baking in their own self-interest, the end result will be that the town has enough bread for people to eat, right? It's sometimes referred to as the invisible hand. More modern economists have called it spontaneous order, but basically it's this idea of order coming from chaos. On the moral side, he argued for a type of moral sentimentism, a modified type. And that's a type of virtue ethics built on sympathy for other people. We can't quite understand other people, but we can have sympathy for their positions that comes from within ourselves. So all of our actions towards others are built towards that, and we have to follow certain virtues such as justice and fairness within our life to live that out. Now we'll fast forward a little bit to Ayn Rand, who is also an ethical egoist, and she argues that she takes it a step further than Stirner or Adam Smith. She believes that we can act altruistically, but that it's immoral for us to do so. It's a very unique take. She says that the end goal of altruism is self-sacrifice, and the ultimate barometer by which someone views altruism is the barometer of sacrifice in your life for another person. So she deduces from that that altruism is immoral because it seeks the death of the self. She instead argues that the self is an end in oneself, that we have a duty to ourselves and our own survival, and she calls that self-responsibility. She views the ideal political form as a sort of libertarian state where each person is only responsible for themselves and the things they find valuable. Um, she says that because we're rational, rationality is going to tell us what virtues to follow, and that we need to use those various virtues to live a good life and live morally, um, and calls that a type of moral ambition, right? We have to want to be better than what we were before, and we do that by having some ambition. Now, what will I say about ethical egoism and Ayn Rand's ethical egoism in particular? These egoism as a whole has a problem of incoherence, right? So if we start with the idea that everyone benefits from self-interest, that may be true in the grand scheme of things, but why should I, as the individual, care if society benefits from self-interest if all I care about is self-interest, right? That's a bit incoherent. Not to say that I'm against society, right? But if that's all I care about is self-interest, then what does it matter if society's doing well, right? The next issue is the issue of um, competing duties. So if you're a manager at a corporation, you have a fiduciary duty to the corporation, but you also have a duty to yourself, right? So how do you balance those competing duties? Is it the case that your self-interest says that you should take a bribe and put the corporation at harm, or should you, put the corporation first and turn down any bribes, even though it would harm you personally, right? So that's a bit of a challenge with egoism as a whole. For me, the biggest problem, though, is really the non-falsifiability of it, of egoism, because when it comes down to it, when we start second guessing the motives of other people, then are we really practicing good philosophy, right? If someone tells us they do something for a reason, who are we to doubt their reason, right? Not to say that there aren't people that lie about their reasons, but at the end of the day, you've got to draw a line on where you are going to place your belief. And if someone says they're doing a good act just because they want to do a good act, then it seems to me that we should take them at their word at it. And then the final note about egoism is, there are examples in real life of people benefiting from cooperation, um, and from putting the interest of others in front of themselves, right? Society as a whole has benefited from cooperation. Uh, just a simple example, helping out your neighbors, right? Um, let's say my neighbor's power goes out, so I bring them a solar panel and a battery, right? That doesn't benefit me. I mean, a psychological egoist could say that it's all just about my trying to feel altruistic, but sometimes it might just be the case that you just want to help somebody. Hello and welcome back. So now we're going to move on to social contract theory, starting with Thomas Hobbes. So in the 1500s, Thomas Hobbes wrote this excellent book called Leviathan, which argues that we as humans need to follow the right of a absolute monarch, a divinely granted king who rules with absolute power. He argued that because we're self-interested, but we've learned over time that society's the best thing. See, in the state of nature, life was nasty, brutish, and short, and we were in a constant war of all against all for the limited resources that we find. Um, we were in that constant war because each one of us has a right to life, has a right to maintain our life by any means necessary. So, for example, a starving person has the right to go and use force to take the food of someone else. When we saw how brutish and short our life was, we discovered a law of nature, which is to seek peace and follow it. So, what eventually happened is those people that were able to use force the best to gather up societies and to get people to follow them under the strictures of force, um, established order. And part of that order was morality, which was a social convention, right? So, what's required of us? What's required is that we follow the laws set out by the leaders. And why should we obey? Because they're the arbiters of force. Now, this is a pretty brutalist theory, and to some extent, we can see how later thinkers such as Stirner or um, Ayn Rand would draw from this, and even Adam Smith, right? They would draw from this idea that we have to follow the rulers because we're self-interested, and if we don't, we're going to, use violence. Stirner said that, that's the only way to transfer property is through violence, right? So he understood what Thomas Hobbes was saying about the state of nature and about laws um, requiring us to be moral. However, Stirner says that those laws are just an illusion, whereas Hobbes says those laws are a real thing instituted by force. So that takes us a bit later to Kantian contractarianism, which basically says that each person has natural moral equality and that it's in each person's interest to create a system of government that treats all people with that equality. And each person's interest is also a matter of moral concern. So, for example, if we're creating this society, we shouldn't have it that certain members of the society are starving or in homelessness or are orphan children, right? We would want to create a society that took care of their interests because it was a matter of moral concern. All right, so that brings us to John Rawls. John Rawls was a modern philosopher, and he actually died not too long ago. Funny story about John Rawls. When I was doing my master's degree, took a class from one of his former students. And let me tell you, she was an absolute nightmare. If that's how she was, I can't imagine how it was to take a class under John Rawls. So, John Rawls argued that we needed to develop a society that started from something called the original position. The original position was this hypothetical space in which all members would come to an agreement about how society should look while within a veil of ignorance where no person would know what their place in that society would be. He argued that this would make the most fair outcomes because if no one knew what their position was going to be, no one would advocate for unfair practices such as slavery. Because why would you want to have something like slavery in a society if there's a possibility that you might end up being a slave in that society? John Rawls was hugely influential in American political philosophy and in political science as well. He argued for a type of modern liberalism that focused on the rights of the individual and was built on Kantian contractarianism. This equality of all persons and this idea that every person's rights should be cared for. This idea that we shouldn't have society with these huge imbalances of justice, and we shouldn't have societies where people are treated immorally. Kind of wrapping it all together, in this lecture, we've talked about psychological egoism, that idea that no one can be altruistic and that people are only looking out for their self interest. Ethical egoism, that idea that even if we could be altruistic, maybe we shouldn't be altruistic, and that instead we should only look out for ourselves, and that people benefit the most by looking out for themselves. And we've looked at social contract theory, this idea that people are self interested, but we understand that society is the best way to arrange ourselves and that we have several ways to create a society. We could be a monarchy, We could be a liberal democracy. We could be a communist society. We could be any of these other things, but we have to come to some agreement on how society is formed based on the moral nature of the person. So coming together to the final bit, why should we be moral if we only care about ourselves? Well, each of these theories would tell us that we should try and be moral because we are social creatures and that we cannot survive well if we don't look out for the interest of other people from time to time, or if we don't act in ways that benefit other people. Now, whether the internal motivations are self-serving or not, the end goal is that we're part of a society and we need to act like it. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture.
Disculpe. Puede...
No, esto violaría mi propio interés.
Sorry.
There. We need to hear it back.